ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Lakmahal Community Library and the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust, I would like to welcome you all to today's presentation. A World of Books, Martin Wickramasinghe in Colombo. Before we begin anything, I'd like to acknowledge the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust for supporting and encouraging events like this and the Lakmahal Community Library for hosting us. Well, this gathering is special because we have students, readers, writers, researchers, library members and the long-term admirers of Mr. Wickramasinghe in the room here with us. Alright, I'm Hirun Matheesha. I'll be your moderator for the evening. Alright, when we talk about Martin Wickramasinghe, we always talk about the exceptional writer he was. But this evening, we're talking about something far more human. We're talking about something far more human. Martin Wickramasinghe came to Colombo when he was 16 years old, without proper school education. He was wandering through the city of Colombo, the city which was constantly evolving and changing. Ladies and gentlemen, Colombo between 1906 and 1916 became his classroom. The libraries, the people, the conversations, most importantly, the books he read shaped his mind before he published anything.
One more.
And now, I have the privilege of introducing the speaker for the evening, Uditha Devapriya. Many of you already know him through his writings, articles, and research. He has been studying, researching Mr. Wickramasinghe for months. He's here today to present a different perspective, a fresh perspective, not on what he wrote, not on what Martin Wickramasinghe wrote, but on what he read and how the books he confronted when he was in Colombo shaped the mind we celebrate today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very own speaker, Uditha Devapriya.
Thank you, Hirun. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming despite the weather. I want to begin with a quote. It has a wider relevance to today's presentation. I will return to it towards the end of my presentation, and I will reveal who said it as well. But I would request you all to bear it in mind as we progress. I think Hirun introduced me much better than I ever could, though I suspect he was being too kind towards me. I will therefore skip the icebreaker. Martin Wickramasinghe was easily Sri Lanka's most well-known and prominent novelist and critic of the 20th century. In a career spanning 60 years, his first major work was published in 1914, his last in 1973. He authored some 13 novels, a number of short story collections, and countless collections of essays on art, culture, history, and politics. In terms of the themes that he tackled in these works, he was a polymath. Though not an artist in the conventional sense of the word, he was a leading modernist in Sri Lanka and perhaps in South Asia, even if we often do not give him credit for this. For obvious reasons, it is his fiction that has endeared him to most of the reading public in Sri Lanka. Why shouldn't it? After all, there's hardly a student or a university undergraduate who has not heard of Madol Dua, the Koggala trilogy, or even Viragya. These are seminal works in the context of Sri Lankan and Sinhala literature, and they have been translated to several languages, including Hindi and Chinese. By all accounts, Wickramasinghe was a voracious writer. He was also quite generous with his books. He had a tendency, which I suppose is intrinsic to all of us writers, of gifting them to everyone he met and became friends with. If you read through his letters and correspondences, all carefully preserved at the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust, you will find that in every other letter someone writes to him, there is an acknowledgement of a gift of several books. It did not matter who it was. The US ambassador in Colombo.
It was very kind of you recently to send me the inscribed copies of two of your books, Aspects of Sinhalese Culture and Sinhala Language and Culture.
The warden of a leading school in Sri Lanka.
I'm writing to thank you very much for the copy of your book, which you have so kindly sent me. I have not yet had time to read it, but I am sure it will be interesting.
Or the guard at a museum in Kent.
On returning to Ceylon, I sent the keeper of the Darwin Museum a copy of the 5th revised edition of my Sinhala book on Darwinism and evolution.
The fact that he could reach out to different kinds of people from different backgrounds and stations in life, and to use his books to connect with them at an intellectual level, shows how much of a networker he was, in addition to being a thinker. This was true at almost all points and stages in his life. Long after he had become well established, he was writing letter after letter, correspondence after correspondence, to almost everyone he met. And he was gifting his books to all of them. Born a decade before the turn of the 20th century, Martin Wickramasinghe quickly became the preeminent public intellectual and contrarian thinker of his time in Sri Lanka. He fused these two personalities within himself, and in doing so made a contribution, significant at that, as a thinker. I see this contribution as fundamentally being two-way. First, he wrote on a range of topics in his mother tongue Sinhala, topics which had not been accessible for local readers until then. Second, using his first-hand knowledge of his culture, he applied the frameworks of foreign thinkers and scholars and wrote extensively in English on the world he came from. In doing so, he redefined what it meant to be a public intellectual.
The powerful shape of public discourse, who made it clear that one cannot be a public intellectual without raising the public.
To have written so much and to have made such a contribution, Wickramasinghe no doubt read a great deal before he put down his thoughts into pen and paper. To understand this and appreciate it more fully, however, we need to be aware not so much of what he wrote as what he read, and more importantly, how he reflected on what he read. The Martin Wickramasinghe collection at the National Library in Colombo contains over 5,000 titles. Most of them are worn out and dusty, although well preserved. Some are recent additions. The oldest among the collection dates back to the 1900s and 1910s. Straddling different periods, genres, and subjects, they remain a useful guide to the man who owned them, read them, and wrote on the topics that they cover. Arguably, the most interesting point about them are the annotations. Most of these annotations are marginal comments. Some point to other sources and books. Many are critical, hardly any laudatory. He was not a man who was fond to giving praise most of the time. On the side of one page, in the 1934 edition of Caroline Rhys Davids's Outline of Buddhism, to give just one example, he argues that the author seems ignorant of modern anthropology. In his copy of Maurice Baring's An Outline of Russian Literature, published in 1914, he criticizes the author's characterization of Leo Tolstoy. To his criticism of Tolstoy, Wickramasinghe responds that he wrote that the observation is wrong and that it is basically the opposite of what Tolstoy was as a person. Ladies and gentlemen, between Baring's book and Rhys Davids' book, there is a space of 20 years. During this period, Wickramasinghe matured and evolved. Beginning his life in Colombo as an assistant in a shop, he went on to write articles to the Dinamina, the leading newspaper of the time in Sri Lanka. In 1914, Wickramasinghe wrote his first novel, Leela. His preface to the very first edition of his first novel makes it clear how much of an influence the books that he was reading was having on him. In no ambivalent terms, he notes the futility of drawing lines between Western and Eastern philosophy, Western and Eastern science, between ways of looking at the world. The story itself unremittingly critiques tradition and order.
There cannot be one Shastra for Asiatic people and another Shastra for Western people.
Such attitudes could only have been fostered through the books that he was devouring. As he himself recounts in his memoirs Upandasita, he started reading rationalist and Western texts almost as soon as he shifted to Colombo in 1906. Wickramasinghe's granddaughter remembers that library of his very well. She also recalls that he was insistent that his children and grandchildren read English and that they did not limit themselves to Sinhala or, for that matter, Sri Lankan literature. It is, of course, not within the scope of this lecture to delve into these aspects of Wickramasinghe's life. However, it is clear that he could not have written what he wrote without reading what he read. This is a convoluted way of putting it, but it is true. To appreciate it, we need to realize that his collection at the National Library is probably a sizable fraction of the total number of books and publications that he acquired throughout his life. Indeed, at one point in his memoirs, Upandasita, he confesses that he no longer has a copy of a certain book or text with him. Yet the memory of what he read remained clear and sharp in his mind. What that indicates, more than anything else, is that he had no alternative to the books that he read. Deprived of formal education at a fairly early stage in his life, books became a crucial part of his growing up. To appreciate this fact further, it is necessary, however, to go back and revisit his childhood and his upbringing. Martin Wickramasinghe was born 135 years ago, on the 29th of May 1890, in the southern village of Kokala, some 22 kilometers from Galle and 140 kilometers from Colombo. Kokala stood at a midpoint between Galle and Madura, two of the leading coastal villages in British Ceylon. In his two memoirs, Apegama and Upandasita, Wickramasinghe remembers vividly the world he was born to. A highly impressionable mind, he often wandered around his village, playing with children his age and exploring the natural surroundings. When he moved to a new school, Buena Vista College, run by the Anglican Church in Unavatuna, he spent his free time exploring the jungle beaches in Rumasa.
Twice or thrice a week after school was over, I went to the Rumasa forest. I was vaguely certain there were lions in the Rumasa. I also felt there was something heroic in wandering around the jungle in Rumasal.
In Koggala, Unavatuna and Gaul, he encountered many worlds and grew familiar with all of them. Though he was born to a rural and traditional setting, he found himself in the midst of Buddhist monks, Christian missionaries, and a culture that had fallen under the sway of European colonialism for over 300 years. It was during these formative years that he gained first-hand knowledge of the culture and environment of southern Sri Lanka. This was a highly transitionary period. The Gaul harbour, which had once commanded prestige, was slowly fading away, giving way to Colombo. It was against the backdrop of these transitions that he was forced to halt his studies and move to Colombo in 1906.
I find it difficult to recapture and convey the rapturous reactions of a village boy on seeing Colombo for the first time. The food shops, the jetty, breakwater, and harbour alike captivated me. The great glass display window of a food shop takes diamond plate colours, bright with electric light, was one such sight that held me.
Martin Wickramasinghe had first visited Colombo when he was still studying at Buena Vista. Almost immediately, he grew fascinated by the rhythms of life that animated the city. With his family, he visited some of the more popular sites in the area, including the National Museum. By the turn of the 20th century, these institutions had become symbols of a changing age, capturing a time when Sri Lanka was caught in the throes of colonialism, yet was clamoring to discover its past. It was to this world that he shifted in 1906. Almost immediately, the 16-year-old Wickramasinghe was thrown into an unfamiliar environment. When he arrived, Colombo was being rocked by an outpouring of anger and hostility. A group of carters had begun a protest against municipal laws and regulations, and they had virtually brought the city to a standstill.
It was the first occasion during which the labour dispute in Ceylon reflected the strong feeling of discontent against the government.
In 1907, a year after Wickramasinghe arrived in Colombo, 20th Century Impressions of Ceylon was published. Edited by Arnold Wright, the book describes in great detail the roads, the areas, and the institutions in Colombo, the world that Wickramasinghe was now part of. The fort or Peta area where he worked was the site of numerous commercial houses and administrative buildings. This was one of the most densely populated areas of the city, if not country, inhabited almost entirely by, I quote, natives. Not far from Peta lay the Cinnamon Gardens, which in the early 20th century had transformed into the most fashionable suburb in the city, housing the residences of its most affluent elites. It was against this setting that Wickramasinghe began reading as many books as he could. Lacking formal education, he made the most of what he had by subscribing to foreign magazines, attending public discussions, and learning to write. We have two sources for the books that he read at this point in his life. The first are his memoirs, Upandasita. The second is the bibliography of his collection at the National Library. While the latter has been well catalogued and offers a vivid glimpse into the titles, authors, and genres he immersed himself in, Wickramasinghe's recollections in Upandasita give us a clearer picture of the books that caught him and transfixed him in his first few years in the city. Colombo came as a revelation to him. In Koggala, Wickramasinghe had played truant, whiling away the time with his friends. In Colombo, he became a different man. At home, he had been curious about science and nature. In the city, he sought to satisfy this curiosity through books and publications and periodicals. It was against this backdrop that he came across rationalist writers and free thinkers and began reading them.
My mind was possessed by a desire to learn about the beginning and end of the world. None of the bookshops in Colombo carried these books.
One of the first authors that he recollects in his memoirs is Robert Ingersoll, a rationalist, an orator, one of the leading figures of the age of free thought in the United States. Robert Ingersoll had by now exercised a profound influence on the cause of radical thought and politics in India and Sri Lanka. His relentless criticism of organized religion, specifically Christianity, caught on in Ceylon, then at the heyday of the Buddhist revival. The likes of Ingersoll and the British rationalist Charles Bradlaugh found common ground between their critique of Christianity and their affinity for Eastern religions.
In Ceylon, the literature of the free thought movement was available and had been quoted during the Parliamentary debate.
Having come across Ingersoll, young Wickramasinghe seems to have been taken up by his writings. Interestingly, it seems to have been through Ingersoll that he made his discovery of Charles Darwin. In Upandasita, Wickramasinghe remembers sifting through the pages of the Rationalist Press Association. Founded by the English secularist Charles Watt in 1885, the Rationalist Press Association became the main outlet for the leading scientific thinkers and free thinkers of the time. Among the authors they published were the British science writer Samuel Lane and the German zoologist Ernst Haeckel. The biologist Thomas Huxley, one of Darwin's most fervent defenders, also caught his attention. From Ingersoll, Lane, Haeckel, Darwin, and the Rationalist Press Association, young Wickramasinghe moved on to other writers. A perusal of the first few chapters of Upandasita and the catalogue of the Wickramasinghe collection at the National Library reveals to us a fairly eclectic range of academics and freethinkers. The list of science and rationalist writers he read at this stage included Edward Clodd, Dennis Hurd, A.C. Haddon, Percy Meehl, Paul Keres, and Hans Reichenberg. What is important to note is that while these were all contrarian thinkers, not all of them thought alike or subscribed to the same beliefs. Dennis Hurd, for instance, was a clergyman, a member of the Church of England who converted to socialism and became an advocate of the working class. A.C. Haddon was a leading anthropologist who had done field work in Southeast Asia, including Borneo. Paul Keres was one of the leading advocates of monism, a philosophy which sought not so much to disprove religion as to unearth a synthesis between science and faith. Keres's The Gospel of the Buddha, first published in 1894, transfixed Martin Wickramasinghe. Reflecting on his work and philosophy, young Wickramasinghe noted, much later on of course, how popular such writers and books had become in Colombo.
Even Buddhists in the East who did not know English were familiar with the two books authored by Paul Keres, Gospel of the Buddha and Nirvana. He was the editor of the monthly magazine Open Court and the magazine Monist. I was a subscriber to both magazines by the time I was 20 years of age.
The popularity of these works among non-English speakers seems to have intrigued Wickramasinghe. Yet, by the early 20th century, such works had become affordable and accessible to a great many people, even in places like Colombo, as this quote by Eric Hobsbawm puts it well.
Progress emancipated from tradition seemed to imply a militant break with ancient beliefs which found passionate expression in the behavior of the militants of popular movements, as well as of the middle class intellectuals. The book named Moses of Darwin was to be more widely read than the writings of Marx himself.
The popularity of these magazines and journals helped transmit the most radical ideas to the most open minds. For someone like Wickramasinghe, this proved to be a crucible of learning. Yet, what is relevant here is not that he read widely or that he immersed himself in many writings. It is that he did not read blindly and did not respect the writers and thinkers he came across merely because of their reputation abroad.
It was after 4 or 5 years that I understood that Ingersoll was not a wise man, but a clever lawyer and an orator who had a booming voice.
In other words, the more he read, the more he reflected on what he read. And the more he reflected on what he read, the more he became critical of the writers he encountered. This gave him the elasticity he needed to become a writer himself. To that end, ladies and gentlemen, Wickramasinghe's time in Colombo made three distinct contributions to his career as the leading writer and public intellectual of 20th century Sri Lanka. First, it helped him disassociate himself from the popular writers of his day in the country. Perhaps the most popular of his contemporaries and near contemporaries in the world of literature was Piyadasa Sirisena. More a pamphleteer than novelist, more a propagandist than critic, Sirisena had staked his reputation on a series of novels which essentially portrayed Buddhists in a positive light and Christians in a negative light. As the dramatist and critic Edrivira Sarachandra has put it, Wickramasinghe disagreed with Piyadasa Sirisena's worldview. Now, Leela, Sarachandra noted that
indeed it appears that Leela is a late attack on Piyadasa Sirisena and his novel Jayatissa and Rosalind.
The second contribution was that it fueled in Wickramasinghe a desire to write to public platforms. At the turn of the 20th century, the main platform for the exchange of ideas in a society like Sri Lanka would have been the newspaper. Wickramasinghe wrote his first novel, as we all know, in 1914. Fueled by the rationalist periodicals and journals he was reading, he wrote his first article to the Dinamina in 1916, 2 years later. Simply titled Plants and Animals, his first article landed him in the thick of controversy. In it, he raised hard-hitting questions about rebirth and reincarnation.
People were intrigued and some outraged by this unheard of man questioning not only Buddhist but also in the belief in rebirth.
The third contribution, as he graduated from one writer to another, was that the books that he read encouraged him to study and become more proficient in English. Rather ironically, it also encouraged him to brush up his knowledge of Sinhala language and literature. The result is that he became well versed in both English and Sinhala, giving him a crucial foundation at a critical juncture in his life.
My cousin introduced me to UP Ekanayaka. I went to see him twice a week at his bookshop and read the Guthilaya, Kavishekara and Hansa Sandesha.
Arguably, these were Martin Wickramasinghe's most fruitful years. At the end of it all, he had progressed quite far in his thinking. Having read some of the leading scholarly publications of his time, he was now ready to embark on a career as a thinker on his own account. It was against this backdrop that he found employment at the Dinamina in 1920. The leading Sinhala daily of the time, as I mentioned earlier, the Dinamina gave Wickramasinghe the intellectual freedom that he needed to explore topics and subjects which had engrossed him in Colombo. Reflecting on this period much later, he acknowledged how crucial this entry to the world of newspapers had been in shaping the way he thought.
In the village, I engaged in games which were physically demanding. I rowed boats on the river, ventured into the jungle to pick guava, madam, mango and cashew and enjoyed myself thoroughly. 1 year in Colombo had changed me. I spent the money I earned on books without thinking about Amma. When I realized that this was very selfish of me, I was very hurt. Spending on books without thinking is also a vice.
Ladies and gentlemen, I began this presentation with a quote. I would like to return to it. I would also like to acknowledge the person who uttered it, who is with us today. This concluding part of the presentation owes much to his views on Wickramasinghe, and I would be deeply ungrateful if I did not acknowledge them. Ladies and gentlemen, it was none other than Dr. Rajiv Vijayasinghe. This quote is rather interesting and fascinating. It is a question that Dr. Vijay Singh has answered well for me, and it is one that I will try to answer in this concluding passage. As I have mentioned more than once, Martin Wickramasinghe lacked formal education. Yet the little education that he received in Koggala, Unavattuna and Ahangama gave him the foundation to read. More importantly, it built in him a love for reading which was to last his entire lifetime. On at least one occasion, he confessed that this turned him into an omnivorous reader, someone who immersed himself in books purely for the intellectual pleasure that it brought. Yet at the turn of the 20th century, not a few free thinkers and public intellectuals, even novelists, followed this trajectory. Here, one can draw parallels between Wickramasinghe and the British writer H.G. Wells. Today, Wells is known for his visionary science fiction novels, The Time Machine, The Invisible Man and The War of the Worlds. Yet what is not that well known about him is that he too had to abandon formal education. As with Wickramasinghe, he had to find work and only later find fulfillment as a writer. What one biographer noted about Wells, one could almost validly apply to Wickramasinghe.
He had begun to understand what his own capacities were, to learn fast, to plan his work, to observe people about him, to know what he valued most, to fight for what he wanted and to win. He knew he enjoyed good conversation, difficult books, intellectual puzzles and saliences, and the beauty of the natural world. He noticed the world around him with exceptional vividness and thought about it.
He noticed the world around him with exceptional vividness and thought about it. Could any sentence better sum up the impact that the books he read had on Martin Wickramasinghe and on his writing career? I think not, ladies and gentlemen. And on that note, I end my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Uditha, for that insightful presentation. It's time for us now to move on to the Q&A session. I'm sure our audience has a lot of questions to ask from you, but to begin the conversation, I will ask a question myself, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. So you mentioned in your presentation that Martin Wickramasinghe came to Colombo in 1906, and then he published his first novel in 1914, just 8 years later, in such a short time. So, what do you think the foundation was?
Well, I think there were several influences. Thank you, by the way, Hirun, for asking that question. If you read through Upandasita, you will come across some of his most evocative, some of the most evocative passages in Upandasita are his recollections of his growing up in Koggala. One of the people that he meets in Koggala, that he comes under the influence of in Koggala, is his distant cousin, a monk called Koggala Dhirananda Thera. Dhirananda Thera becomes very pivotal. He becomes his second teacher, basically. He's first sent to the local Guru Nanse, under his Guru Nanse, and later on he comes under the tutelage of Koggala Dhirananda and Sudarshanarama, which is a temple that's no longer there in Koggala. Basically, Dhirananda is something of a rebel. He is chastised more than once by the clerical establishment for putting dangerous thoughts into the minds of young people, as all free-thinking religious figures usually did. He was a star product of the Vidyodaya Pirivena, and he had a wide knowledge of Pali, Sanskrit and Sinhala. If you read Upandasita, you will realize that he taught Wickramasinghe not just Pali, Sanskrit and Sinhala, but also more than a smattering of English. Then when Wickramasinghe comes to Colombo and establishes himself in employment, Koggala Dhirananda Thera abandons his robes and becomes a lay figure. At one point, Dhirananda, he's not a Thera anymore, wants to get Wickramasinghe to enter the notarial examination, which was a very prestigious examination at the time. And Dhiran, or rather Wickramasinghe, confesses at that point that he isn't too knowledgeable about Sinhala. It's at that point that Dhirananda, basically not a Thera anymore, directs him to UP Ekanayaka, the gentleman I mentioned in my presentation. So if there was a foundation, I would say he had two firm foundations. One was his father and mother, who, if you read Upandasita, you will realize was very indulgent towards him. He was the only son in a family of 8 daughters. Second, his mentor, his great mentor, called Dhirananda. I suppose you can call those the two foundations in his intellectual life.
That's interesting. That answered my question. And now we can open the floor to the audience, and we have Devi here. Devi here to handle the question. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand, and Devi will handle the rest.
Hi, Chinova. So it was a nice presentation. So my question to you would be, how did Martin Wickramasinghe basically interact with the diplomatic community, and how did it shape his worldview?
Interesting question. So one of the aspects of Wickramasinghe's life and career which I'm very keen on exploring further is his reputation as a cultural figure and a cultural ambassador in Sri Lanka. The main source we have for the people that he interacted with at the diplomatic level are the letters and correspondences which can be found at the Wickramasinghe Trust. So he was sharing, by the 1960s and 70s, which is when you have a peak in the frequency of exchanges of these letters with prominent figures, he's interacting with the American ambassador, with the British High Commission, with the Indian High Commission, and basically with the socialist world. He was very much inclined towards the socialist world, and Eastern European countries, you have several of his books translated to those languages. So as a quasi-diplomatic figure, Wickramasinghe was very open to exchanging letters with, and even going so far as to getting to know the ambassadors and high commissioners of those countries in Sri Lanka, and going one step further, once he is in those countries, he is meeting these high dignitaries as well. I don't know whether you noticed one of the photos that I featured in the presentation has Wickramasinghe with Zhou Enlai. So he met Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong in China, and he wrote a collection of essays or a book about it called Navachina Vivadina. He traveled to Russia thrice, I think more than twice if I'm not mistaken. He traveled to Cuba and basically to other countries as well. He didn't travel to the US for some reason, but he was there in France and the UK. He was a good networker. He was also a very good traveler, and through these travels he made contact with many of these diplomatic figures.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. If you all have any questions, you can just raise your hand.
So, in your research, Burma has published Siddhartha in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, and Bhavataranya was Martin Wickramasinghe's final fate now, right? So, there's one paragraph in Bhavataranya which is kind of a throwback, or it's reminiscent of what Hirun Matheesha wrote in Siddhartha. Do you think there was some influence?
Well, in the course of my research, I have found at least 3 books which seem to have influenced Wickramasinghe's thinking in Bhavataranya. The first, which was very kindly pointed out to me by Professor Jayadeva, is Giovanni Papini's Life of Christ. I hadn't come across that book in my research. It was Professor Yangoda who actually pointed that out to me. The second and the more familiar work for me was Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ, because as we all know, Kazantzakis' book showed Christ as more than a superhuman figure. He is basically a human figure in that, succumbing to all kinds of pleasures and whatnot. Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha is, I would say, a third influence, because He was an avid reader of Hermann Hesse. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it is there in the catalogue of the National Library as well. I may be wrong, because there's about 5,100 plus copies or other titles. But you're absolutely right. I think that whole view of the Buddha was very unconventional for his time. We have come across newspaper editorials and articles which basically accuse him of being seditious and being very disrespectful towards Buddhism. There's at least one person who basically contends that he should be put in jail for disrespecting the Buddha. He faced all these criticisms with great equanimity. It was the last 3 or 2 years of his life in any case. I would say that of the 3 influences I mentioned, Papini's book seems to be the stronger one, followed by Kazantzakis, and not a little bit of Hesse as well.
Thank you very much, sir, for that question. We'd love to hear a few more questions from the audience since we have time, so feel free to ask questions.
Questions or basically make comments, either. Yes, Dr. Vijay Singh.
He has certainly established himself as a Buddhist well before the Second World War. But I was wondering how the next wave reacted to him. The Hela movement, led by Uditha Devapriya. And one is the Ashtitan, and I know very little about these subjects, but I still have this vivid memory in school when we were asked to read Rohini. And I just happened to read Savatini's, which is very much a novel on which Rohini is based. And I remember discussing this with my form master at the time, who was the least famous of the three of Hela people in St. Thomas's. Thus, Alishan Abudu Kapreva, much better known. And he told me rather dismissively, Martin Wickramasinghe is entirely deliberate. All his blocks are taken from elsewhere. I think that's hard because you can take blocks from elsewhere and transform them. But there seems to be a certain level of contempt or rivalry between the representatives of Uditha Devapriya, who was a great hero, and Martin Wickramasinghe. What do you know about the reaction of that group to this? Just as you said, Wickramasinghe reacted to Devasasana. What happened later when he became the lawyer?
Well, first of all, I wish Professor Sadhguru was here. I don't think he is. So, based on my research, what I found out was he shared a deep, abiding friendship with Munidasa Kumaratunga while being critical of his friend. So, there's one passage in Sinhala language and culture, which was written, I think, towards the latter part of his life, where he critiques Munidasa Kumaratunga and the Hela Haula, which came later, for not being sufficiently receptive to the fact that languages are evolving entities. So as we all know, the Hela Haula was perpetually in search of a very pure and chaste form of Sinhala, the Sinhala language. Professor Sadhguru shared this very interesting anecdote with me. After Madolduwa came out, one prominent figure of the Hela Haula came out with a book called, basically the book was basically a list of complaints about the grammatical errors and faults in Madolduwa. So Professor Kopereva basically made the point that it was about 3 or 4 times the weight of Madolduwa. So there was no love lost between the two. But I would make a distinction between Munidasa Kumaratunga and the later generation of the Hela Haulists, as I call them. The later generation were more wont towards being hostile towards him. They were much more hostile towards him than Munidasa Kumaratunga himself, no doubt because the two of them shared a very deep abiding friendship. You see this rivalry also playing out between Wickramasinghe and Sarat Chandra much later in life. Sarat Chandra was one of the most ardent defenders of Wickramasinghe when he was establishing himself early on. But towards the end of his life, Wickramasinghe comes out with this book called Sinhala Navakatha Saha Japan Kamakatha Sevanara, the Sinhalese novel and the shadow of Japanese erotic literature, where he criticizes Sarat Chandra for being influenced by forms of literature which he felt were not intrinsic to the tradition of Sinhala literature. He had a very complex relationship with his contemporaries, and I think that basically was because he refused to identify himself with literary or political groups, even though he had his ideologies. To answer your question very briefly, Dr. Vijay Singh, with Munidasa Kumaratunga, he shared a very critical but amiable friendship. But with the later generation of the Helahaulis, Jinadasa and so on and so forth, the very famous Helahaulis who taught at St. Thomas's, they were much more inclined to view him hostilely, very hostile.
Thank you very much, sir, for that question. So as we mentioned earlier, you are free to add comments as well if you want.
Hello, Uditha.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That is really insightful. So since we are talking about the ideological standpoint, just wanted to ask, because Martin Luther King was never a superficial nationalist, but at the same time he held strong, you could say, anti-colonial beliefs, and also he had a strong sense of identity, definitely. But at the same time, in the 1950s, I believe he accepted the member of British order from the Queen. So was this ever reconciled? Like, I just couldn't find any, like, any express his thoughts on how he decided on accepting it. Just wanted to hear.
I think there's a interesting anecdote about the day he accepted it, and I think the members of the Wickramasinghe family are here as well, so maybe they can shed light on what they remember about this incident. From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, his sons, were they too happy with him accepting the MB?
He still didn't want him to accept.
He still didn't want him to accept. So at that stage in life, I think
His children were all very ardent leftists at that time, so they didn't think he should be accepted.
but of course there's a very famous photo of him accepting it under Queen Elizabeth.
Can I just request?
Yes.
Does that include SK as well?
That I'm not sure. I know the others did it. Mali, did SK object to him getting the
I don't think
SK?
he objected.
Huh?
I don't think he objected.
I don't think, yeah, not SK probably.
He was very
Because he
different.
was not the leftist, it was my father and Malin's father who were the leftist at that time. BK and HR. But do you know why Sia actually accepted it?
I'm not really sure.
I don't know. I only know that the children were very angry with him for accepting at that time, but then later on they decided that he did the right thing.
He did the right thing. But this delves into another area that I am researching on with regard to Wickramasinghe. So, as you all know, Wickramasinghe became a member of the Official Languages Commission in the 1950s, but he dropped out. I will be presenting on Wickramasinghe at the Social Scientists Association on the 10th, where I will be discussing this much more clearly. Towards the end of his life, he was the chief guest at the prize giving at Trinity College in 1971. If you have come across that speech, which I don't know whether you have, it's there in one of his collections, he criticizes the conservative Buddhist establishment. And basically he says that they have forced the youth of the country to obedience and conformity so much that eventually it's going to rupture. He said this 2 months before the April insurrection. So Initi even defends S.W. Ali Bandaranayaka's pact with S.J.V. Chellanayaka. You wouldn't have expected a person called the Mahahele Gattaru to be a defender of a political reform of that sort, but he did. He was very respectful of Bandaranayaka as well, and he saw him as a martyr to his cause as well as someone who wanted to achieve something for both Sinhalese and Tamil people. Of course, there are discussions and debates about that. But the point of the matter is, 2 years after his speech at Trinity College, he writes Bhavatarani. He is very, I wouldn't use the word nostalgic, but he is very vivid in his impressions of the culture that he came from, which, by the way, was very much steeped in colonial influences. We are talking about the culture of the southern province of Sri Lanka. Masks, initiation ceremonies, toils and whatnot. these were very much hybrid forms of culture, very much suffused with colonial influences. It's very hard to call him a defender of the status quo, because one of the books that he wrote was aptly titled Wickramasinghe. My knowledge of Sinhala does not permit me to go in depth into the exact nuances of that word, but what I will say is that Wickramasinghe is basically a metaphor for someone who tries to find out or go back to the past in search of something which does not exist. That was his attitude to the past, to basically the whole corpus of Sinhala language, literature, culture, Sri Lankan language, literature, culture, and so on and so forth. He was not nostalgic about a lost utopia that he wanted to resurrect. At the same time, he was a product of his time, but these are aspects that I'm very keen on exploring in my next presentation on the 10th at the SSA. So you're most welcome to come for that.
Thank you very much, sir, for that question. Any more questions from the audience?
Questions or comments?
Or comments?
I don't know very much about,
Wait-
not enough about.
Wait a minute, ma'am.
Say, yeah? I'm afraid I don't know very much, I don't know enough about Martin Luther. Early on, he makes a distinction between the Apollonian and Dionysian cultures in aspects of Sinhala culture, influenced by what Ruth Benedict said. I think it was Nietzsche who made that distinction earlier. So he characterizes Hindu culture as Dionysian, which is given to emotion, excess, etc., and encouraging the culture of the individual. And then he says Sinhala culture, and again, slight difference because he says Hindu on the one side, which is religion, but it has Sinhala on the other side, which is not religion, race and race. And sees that as characterized by restraint, moderation, and so on and so forth. Now, how did that idea evolve over time? Did he change his position on that later on in life, or did he elaborate on that in some way? Did he still see the two cultures as divided along those terms? Because it seems to me that it's more nuanced than that.
But it was certainly more nuanced than what Wickramasinghe made it out to be. I have to be very frank with you on that. Because Benedict herself, if you have read Patterns of Culture, very clearly says that these are types that should not be generalized. They should not be applied to specific cultures, lock, stock, and barrel. And once again, I wish that someone I had interviewed was here, Dr. Sarah Thamugama, who would have been the best authority on this. Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture found a ready audience in the 1930s and 40s. But for reasons I don't want to delve into, because I'm not qualified enough to delve into those issues, the framework that Benedict adopted became very passé and out of fashion by the 1950s and 60s. Wickramasinghe was omnivorous in his reading patterns, and he came across Benedict's book very early on, just as he did come across Malinowski's book on the Western Pacific. He thought he saw Sinhala culture as being fashioned by restraint and Hindu culture as being fashioned by a lack of restraint. You see this dualism play out throughout his writings, almost right until the end. And then comes the big rupture with Bhavataranya, where his depiction of Siddhartha Gautama is quite unlike anything you'd imagine. I still vividly remember the very last sentence in the introduction to Bhavataranya, which is, modern writers have come up with these fantastic, foolish tales of the Buddha flying through air and performing miracles. You would not have expected someone like Wickramasinghe to say that, particularly at the very last stage in his life, but that's what he did. Part of the fascinating thing, one of the most fascinating things about Wickramasinghe is that he's very hard to square. You have aspects of him you don't like, you have aspects of him you like. It's not you either like him or you hate him sort of figure. It's a figure full of a complex tapestry. I mean, you have so many different strands of thinking and believing and seeing in him. So to give a very short answer to your question, I think until that rupture in Bhavataranya, this is my belief, he subscribed to that view of Sinhala culture being so and so and Hindu culture being so and so. A reading that is in itself very problematic for me as someone who's being trained to, look at nuance in everything he or she comes across in scholarship. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that question. So we have time for 2 more questions or comments.
Do we have any understanding of how he reacted to the film? Because in a sense, the films of the 60s advanced him even more onto the national anthem. What was his reaction and his screenplays?
Dr. Rajiv, are you talking about the film adaptations or films overall?
The film adaptation of the trilogy.
Well, he didn't live long enough to see Kaliyuga and Gantya. He saw Gantya here. I'd like to begin with the fact that he gave carte blanche to Lester and Regis Sirivardhana. A person at that stage in his life with such a reputation wouldn't have done that. He did it. And if you look at one of the beautiful things about the film is that the opening is very cinematic. It's very different to the opening in the novel. The novel begins with a long, ponderous passage about Koggala. The film begins with an English lesson. Characteristically, it begins with a reference to Robinson Crusoe, a man who's basically the epitome of the self-made man. And that is the sort of aspiration that PR has in the entire novel and in one sense the trilogy. There's an article he has written, it escapes my mind, where he praises the film. There are 1 or 2 points of criticism that he makes. He says they could have done it better or in a different way. But apart from that, he's very fulsome in his praise for Lester's film. So much so that Lester Dr. Peelis once told me that several directors approached Wickramasinghe to do Marul, but Wickramasinghe was adamant it had to be Lester and no one else. I think that sort of bond developed between the 2 of them. Sadly, Dr. Peelis is not with us here today, and neither for that matter is Sumitra Peelis. But from the conversations I had with them, it's very clear that he saw him as the ideal transmitter of Wickramasinghe's novels into a cinematic medium, just as he saw Regis Sirivardhana as the best person who could translate his ideas into English. Even though Sirivardhana never translated any of his works into English, I think Landmarks of Sinhalese Literature was done by Uditha Devapriya, but apart from that, there was no Regis Sirivardhana. So to answer your question very shortly, he was full of praise for Gantya in the film. Madhur, his eyesight was fading at the time, but I have heard from Dr. Peelis that his eyes started tearing when he heard the dialogues at the premiere.
Thank you very much, sir, for that question. I think we have time for 1 more question or a comment. Anyone from the audience?
Five seconds. 1, 2,
All right then, thank you everyone for the questions, and I think with that we can bring the Q&A session to an end, right?
Yes. So, thank you, Hirun, but I won't let you off right now, Hirun. I think you need to give your vote of thanks.
As we bring this evening to a close, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being here. Thank you to the Lakmahal Community Library for hosting us, and thank you very much the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust, especially Mr. Martin Wickramasinghe, the Secretary of the Trust, for encouraging and supporting these kind of initiatives. And thank you everyone, the audience, for being here, for asking questions, and for the enthusiasm. At last but not least, thank you very much our very own speaker for the evening, Uditha Devapriya, thank you very much. And yeah, we have arranged refreshments at the back, and you can buy the books of Mr. Wickramasinghe at the back as well. That's pretty much it, everyone. So thank you very much once again, and have a pleasant evening, and we will hope to see you again in the future events as well. Thank you.